Well, in many ways, there are two sides of the same coin, globalization and demographics. So in the world before World War II, if you did not have oil and steel, or oil and iron ore and coal and food, the chances were that you were a colony, because you certainly didn't have the strength to challenge an empire. But with globalization, you only needed one of the four, and you could trade for the other three. And so we all started industrializing, we all started urbanizing from the different starting points and at different paces, but we all started down the same path. You fast forward that a while, and it changes how national economics work. Because when you live on a subsistence farm, kids are free labor, you have a whole bunch of them. But when you live in town with an industrial job, you're probably living in a condo, and then kids are really expensive habits, and adults aren't stupid, so we had fewer of them. You play that forward 75 years, and we've had a massive demographic shift in the wider world. It started out when a lot of these countries had a lot of people that were young in their 20s and their 30s back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that generated all the labor you could have possibly wanted and all the consumption you could have wanted. But they kept aging. Nobody was having kids. And by the time you got to the 2000s and the 2010s, we had a lot of cultures that had a lot of people in their late 40s to early 60s, so were rich, but there wasn't anyone to consume the stuff they produced, so they had to export it. What's happening this decade is a lot of countries are moving from that mature worker phase to mass retirement. And we don't have an economic model for what happens when you don't have workers of any age or consumers of any age. And so we know that the German system, the Chinese system, the Korean system, the Italian system, the Japanese system is going to end as we understand it this decade. And with globalization breaking down because of the failure of demographics, the only reason it might survive is if you get a large country with a huge navy and a lot of 20, 30-somethings to share everything with everyone. And that would have to be the United States. But we now have had 3 presidents in a row that have gotten progressively more nationalistic and populist in economic matters, with Biden being the most populist economic leader we have ever had. And betting that Biden or Trump or someone like either of them will continue to choose to sublimate American economic success in order to preserve the Chinese system, that's a bit of a reach. Absolutely. I would argue that the majority of the inflation we're experiencing right now is actually rooted in the labor situation. The baby boomers, which are the largest cadre, just not in the United States, but globally, are all retiring. On average, they retire actually before the end of the year. So we are well past the peak. We're on the downward slope now. And that means we have lost not just the capacity to produce goods in mass, but also to generate the capital that's necessary to keep the entire system running, whether that's for credit card debt or borrowing to build an aircraft carrier battle group. The cost of capital everywhere is going up pretty sharply right now. This is not a one-off. This is not the Federal Reserve. This is demographic. This is people moving into retirement and taking their capital with them, liquidating their stocks and bond portfolios and going into much more conservative, low-risk things like T-bills and cash. This was always going to happen. Now it is happening. So we have a capital crunch, a consumption crunch, and a production crunch all at the same time. On top of that is the political impulse for greater control over our own economic destinies. You can call it mercantilist, you can call it nationalist or populist, really doesn't matter. We're all looking at different interpretations of the same thing. What it is popular. The Biden administration is in the process of firing the starting gun, if you will, on doubling the size of the American industrial plant, because we're going to need that in a world where China and Germany cannot function in the way we've become used to it. But yes, that means that in our constrained labor environment, we have to employ a lot more people. And that means that inflation has nowhere to go but up for a very long period of time, at least 5 years.
What about immigration as a substitute for birth rate? Like, is that a way that we can get around? Maybe we have a few pro-immigration nations around the world that could sort of...
In the mid to long term, that is absolutely true, but in the short term, it's not possible. So 2 things here. Number one, our single largest source of migration for the last 50 years has been Mexico. But Mexico started down the road towards industrialization and urbanization just like everybody else. They just started later. They started in the early 90s. Well, the early 90s was 30 years ago, which means that Mexico's birth rate halved about 25 years ago and never recovered. So net migration from Mexico to the United States has actually been negative for 12 of the last 13 years, and I doubt it's ever going to recover. So our normal one-stop shop is gone. That means we have to go to the Eastern Hemisphere and recruit. And that means we need a conscious, rationally mandated immigration policy, because we can't just pretend that there's no immigration and leave the southern border open. People actually have to get here from a different hemisphere. The problem we're facing right now is we're also going through a political transition in the United States. Every generation or so, we have enough accrued changes to our system, either through changes in culture or technology or geopolitics, that the factions that make up our parties move around. The last big time it went down, it was in the 1930s. We had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and before that transition, big business were all Democrats and African Americans were all Republicans. They switched. What's going on today is we're in a tug of war between the Democrats and the Republicans over who gets organized labor. And the issue that organized labor cares about the most is immigration. So no one at the national level from either party wants to touch migration whatsoever until our internal political placement is settled. That's not going to happen in the next year or two. We're probably looking at having to wait until the next presidential election, not 2024, 2028. So we are missing a wonderful opportunity right now while all of the world is in flux and people are looking for a place to land, and it's just not going to be here for a bit yet. For the United States, I'm not overly concerned. We go through these phases, like I said, every generation or two, and part of the reason why it seems so dire is that the parties themselves are breaking down, and this has happened 6 times before. We will get through this. It's a 5 to 10 year process, and we're like year 6 of it right now. So unfortunately, we still have some time to go, and you add in social media and we're all screaming at one another. And with Elon taking over Twitter, what content moderation there was is now. And I think everybody has noticed that in their own feeds, a lot of the crazy is back because we had 8 years of a failed presidency under Obama and we got through it. We had 4 years of a failed presidency under Trump and we got through it. Now we have Biden, who lots of people have lots of opinions. I don't think he's anyone's favorite. But compared to the last 2 people, he's great because he's actually trying to be president. You might not like his policies, but he actually shows up to work and talks to people, which is something the last 2 didn't do. So I would actually argue that we were well on our way to coming out. And if you look at the midterms, the American preference for rotating and for not liking extremism came through loud and clear. Doesn't mean you have to like where we are. Doesn't mean you have to like where we've been or where we're going. But this is what American democracy feels. This is normal. The rest of the world is the rest of the world. If we really do experience a breakdown in global trade, there are a lot of countries out there that are going to be facing things that are an order of magnitude worse than what we went through with subprime or the Great Recession. And the challenges to democracy in that environment are I would argue that the country I am most concerned about is Germany. Because of the Ukraine war, they have lost access to Russian natural gas, which provided them, in terms of their gross consumption, 40% of the total. And even though they've been able to replace the gas, it's an inelastic market, so natural gas prices in Germany are now 6 times what they were before the war. And Germany is not like the United States, where we like to talk a good talk about how we want energy independence, but we really don't care. So we'll take it from Canada or Mexico or Saudi Arabia. We'll make some ourselves. If we don't think anyone's looking, we'll take some from Venezuela. But the Germans can't do that. They're in a more difficult neighborhood, and precision manufacturing requires reliability. So they work with large state-owned companies that export on fixed contracts through fixed infrastructure. And when that broke down, it didn't just interrupt their natural gas supplies. Those natural gas supplies also provide their electricity, and they also provide the inputs for their petrochemical sector. And the petrochemical output is not exported. It's kept in-house to undergird the entire manufacturing sector. So the entire German manufacturing model has basically collapsed. We are probably going to be looking at the end of the German manufacturing model in less than 2 years. What does Germany have going for it if it doesn't have energy, food, or manufacturing? This is a very different world unless you know your German history, in which case this is a very familiar song. And when the Germans feel stressed economically, things spin out of control in a very short period of time, and no one cares who votes for it.
So in a normal energy project, when the price drops too much, they shut in production and then they restart it later. And no one likes to do that. It costs something, it costs time, and you're not getting income in the meantime, but it can be done. But you can't do that in the Russian permafrost. If the crude stops moving through the permafrost layer for any reason, it freezes into gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice. And when water turns into ice, it expands and it pops the pipe from the inside. What's going on right now is the insurance ban on Russian vessels on January 1 will expand to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. And at the same time, the Europeans are about to enact their ban, saying that no Russian crude whatsoever can be sold by any boat to any any European market. And that is going to force a degree of shut-in the ports. The pressure will build back up to the wells, and then the wells will freeze solid. That's going to happen pretty quick. And since the demand for energy tends to be inelastic, you get an outsized price response. So assuming for the moment that all else is equal, and I realize that is never true, you remove 4 million barrels a day of Siberian output, and you're going to get $180 oil. Now, that was my forecast when I saw you last time. Since then, the Chinese look like they're going out of their way to experience an economic crisis. And if we see a drastic decrease in their ability to absorb crude, that's going to change the price forecast. There's so much in motion right now, but none of it is great. I like companies that center their production and their sales in North America because we've got the highest value-added labor system between Mexico and the United States, and we produce where we sell for the most part. Also, if the product is demographically driven in terms of its demand profile, I like that. And if the end product is very energy intensive for its production, because we have the cheapest electricity and energy in the world, that's great. And if the end product is exportable, that's kind of like my trifecta. And so agricultural processing, petrochemicals, things like that are most of my portfolio. Since the Ukraine war started, I have gotten into commodities in a very big way, but I will caution you that most players in most commodity markets are truly global, and you want to make sure you are not exposed to Ukraine or Russia or Brazil, because the Russian system is fallen apart, the Ukrainian system is unlikely to come back, and Brazil is dependent upon material inputs that come from Russia. So you've got to be very, very careful where you're putting your money in that space, or you're going to get exposed to all the bad along with the good. I don't have the data in front of me, but on the whole, roughly 40 to 50% of Brazilian fertilizer inputs are sourced from the former Soviet Union, and most of the remainder is either China or the Middle East. So, there's no version of this picture that looks good for Brazil. That's a very calm way to put it. Let me make this a little bit more broad. So, most of the economic growth that the world, not the US, the world has experienced since 1990 is that we've brought in an empire worth of raw materials from the Russian space, and we've brought in 1 billion workers from the Chinese space. And the outputs from both of those systems have allowed Brazil to bloom in a way that it never could before. We're now seeing all of that in reverse. And if you remove a lot of the added fertilizer that's come into the situation, then the 2.5 billion people that we have added since 1990 are in some very real danger, because Brazil is the world's second largest agricultural exporter. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is number 5, and Chinese capital has been part of what's made this all work. And we've seen an increase of the Chinese lifespan by over 40%, 50%. Since 1990. These things are all linked together, and when you take away the food supply that has allowed all of this to happen, we get to a very dark place very, very quickly. And you cannot replace fertilizer supplies quickly. Nitrogen and phosphate take a minimum of 3 years. Potash usually takes 10. And so far, we've only lost roughly 1/3 of the former Soviet Union's output of this stuff. And that has already been enough for almost every producer in the world to have gone through all of their reserves. The only reason we're not in a food crisis already is because people had reserves, and Mother Nature was very, very kind to us this past year. There's no way we're going to repeat that next year. We're in this weird situation where the Biden administration is trying to provide letters of comfort to point out to financiers and shippers that these things are not under sanctions in order to limit the damage. But if you're a financial house and you see these sanctions getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and with every new genocide that the Russians propagate, you got to wonder whether you want to be affiliated at all. So most, to this point, of the reduction in fertilizer shipments, roughly 1/3, has been because companies don't want to touch it, not because they're under sanction. What's going to happen over the next years, we're starting to see industrial accidents in a lot of these places because most of the technology, most of the infrastructure that produces this stuff dates back to the 60s, and it's only been held together since 1990 with Western duct tape and technical work and people shoehorning parts into it. That's not happening anymore. So in the natural gas sector, we're literally seeing explosions at gas processing facilities that you can see from space. And fertilizers, in many ways, is a derivative of petrochemicals, especially for nitrogen. And because natural gas is caught up in the Russia-European mix, the Europeans have stopped making it at all. So it's not all just a direct interruption of Russian and Belarusian shipments. So we're seeing pressure throughout the entire supply chain in the former Soviet and European space. And we're only at the beginning of that. Changed the course of the war. The clique that runs the Russian system broadly sees the world from the same point of view as Putin. And so you might get a difference in style, but I don't think you get any difference in the real approach to the conflict, and I don't think the war would end. The question to ask is whether or not Russia's going to win or lose this, and we don't know yet. We will know in May and June, because we're at a bit of an operational pause right now, because the Ukrainians are assimilating a lot of Russian gear that they've captured. They've captured almost twice as much gear from the Russians in the last 3 months as they started the war with, in addition to everything that's come in from NATO. So by the time they're done with that process in the beginning of May, the Ukrainian military will have 5 times the capacity of what it started the war with. That's just incredible. So it's going to be a very different war, but May is when mud season is over, and they can all maneuver and get at each other in a very big way. And we will know by the end of June at the latest who is going to rule at that sort of conflict, and then we can start making predictions about who's going to win. It looks a lot like the history of Russia, an inefficient state that's run by a kleptocratic aristocratic class that oppresses everyone around it in a desperate attempt to find some security. I mean, we've seen this movie before. We've seen it at least 11 times. The explosion in output that we saw since 1990 was largely because of British Petroleum, or I guess it's just BP now, and the Western services firms. They're all gone. And so we know that those fields are going to decay in time, independent of what happens with the sanctions or the tariffs or insurance. I don't want to suggest that Russia is going to go to zero, but the longer this war goes on, the greater the chance that there's going to be damage to the onshore pipelines, in addition to anything that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese do. So we should all consider that anything value added coming out of Russia and anything raw commodity coming out of Russia is going to drop precipitously, and in many cases suddenly. But we shouldn't expect to see much of any of it coming back within the next several years. Because again, the last time it took 30 years to rebuild the capacity, and that's when the West was very tightly involved. We're not anymore. I'm not concerned about rare earths at all. That's a processing issue. And the ore that produces rare earth elements comes from almost every mine in the world as a byproduct. So it's just a question of building out the processing capacity. And once the Chinese started to try to blackmail the Japanese a few years ago, a lot of countries, the US included, built out some of that processing capacity. So if there ever was a shortage, we could kind of switch some gears and within a few months have a domestic supply. So I'm not concerned about that. It's like the one thing I'm not concerned about. Industrial gases are a messy space because every gas has its own economics, but all of them are sourced from something called an air separation unit, which just takes the atmosphere and splits it into different chunks. Most air separation is done for oxygen and nitrogen as part of steel foundries, and that's no exception when it comes to the former Soviet Union. The problem is it requires a second stage of separation in order to get the trace gases like helium and neon. And that second stage is usually done at a different facility that's more advanced. And in the case of the former Soviet Union, where 80% of the stuff comes from, that second stage was largely done in Mariupol, and all the infrastructure has been destroyed. For those of you who don't know, helium and neon are the two critical components in semiconductor etching lasers. So we are going to have a massive global shortage in semiconductor fabrication capacity within a year. Several companies, most notably Taiwanese ones, after the last scare we had with neon, which happened back in 2014 with the last Russia-Ukraine war, have invested a lot in recycling of the cartridges that have. So there are some technologies under development with this and different kinds of lasers to try to slim down the need. It's not happening fast enough, but it is happening. Intel's not reshoring. That's a fundamentally new technology that they're implementing at scale, and most of the high-end fab facilities that the Biden administration is encouraging fall into that category. The key to remember with semiconductors is there's different categories of quality. The high end that goes into servers and phones and computers, that was already done here, as well as in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And so when we expand our footprint of this stuff, we're actually taking market share from allies. The low end